I'm so tired of hearing about stolen land. I'm tired of the land acknowledgments before every corporate meeting and university lecture. I'm tired of progressive activists claiming that America exists on illegitimate territory taken from indigenous people. I'm tired of the guilt tripping, the historical revisionism, and the complete abandonment of how the real world actually works. So let me say this as clearly as possible. The land was not stolen. It was purchased, traded, and conquered. That's how land has changed hands throughout all of human history. That's how borders have been drawn since the beginning of civilization. And if you want to claim that makes America illegitimate, then you better be ready to declare every single nation on earth illegitimate too. Because here's what the left refuses to acknowledge. If we're living on stolen land, then the Indian tribes stole it from other Indian tribes. The Comanches stole it from the Apache. The Iroquois stole it from the neighboring tribes. The Sioux stole it from the Cheyenne. Conquest and displacement happened for thousands of years before Europeans ever stepped foot on this continent. But you never hear about that, do you? You never hear land acknowledgments for the tribes that were wiped out by other tribes. You never hear apologies for the indigenous peoples who were conquered and enslaved by more powerful indigenous peoples. That history gets completely and conveniently ignored because it doesn't fit their narrative. The narrative that America is uniquely evil, that Western civilization is uniquely oppressive, that white people are uniquely guilty. That's what this is really about. Not historical accuracy, not justice for indigenous peoples, but a political weapon to delegitimize America and everything it stands for. And I'm done playing along with it. This episode is going to break down exactly why stolen land narrative is historically illiterate, logically inconsistent, and morally bankrupt. We're going to talk about the conquest, about the purchase, about the treaties, and about the reality of how nations are formed. And we're going to do it aggressively because this lie has been allowed to fester for too long, and it's time someone called everything out for the propaganda that it truly is.
Courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to Awaken America.
Let me start with the most basic historical reality that the left refuses to acknowledge. Conquest is how human civilization has worked since the beginning of time. Every piece of land on this planet has been fought over, conquered, lost, and reconquered multiple times throughout history. The right of conquest is not some uniquely American or European concept. It's a universal feature of human nature. Groups fight for resources. Stronger groups take territory from weaker groups. Borders shift based on who has power to hold them. This isn't controversial. This isn't debatable. This is literally how every nation on earth was formed. England, built on the conquest of the Celts. by the Romans, then the Anglo-Saxons, then the Normans. The current British territory is the result of hundreds of years of warfare and displacement. China, the current borders are a result of thousands of years of dynastic warfare, with each empire conquering and absorbing neighboring territories and people. Mexico, built on the ruins of the Aztec Empire, which itself was built on the conquest of dozens of smaller indigenous groups. The Aztecs were conquerors who enslaved and sacrificed people they defeated. Every single nation has a history of conquest. Every single border was drawn through conflict. If living on conquered land makes you illegitimate, then there is not a single legitimate nation anywhere on Earth. But let's talk specifically about North America, since that's what the stolen land narrative focuses on. The idea that indigenous peoples were living in some kind of peaceful harmony before Europeans arrived is a complete fantasy. Tribal warfare was constant and brutal. The Comanche were one of the most feared warrior cultures in North America. They expanded their territory through violent conquest, displacing and subjugating other tribes. They raided settlements, took slaves, and built an empire through force. The Iroquois Confederacy expanded through military conquest. They destroyed the Huron Confederacy. They drove the Erie tribe to extinction. They conquered territory from the Atlantic to the Mississippi through systematic warfare. The Sioux pushed into the Great Plains by displacing the Cheyenne, Crow, Pawnee, and other tribes. They took territory through force and held it through continued warfare. This ain't a secret history. This is well-documented fact. Indigenous peoples fought each other for land, resources, and power for thousands of years before Europeans even arrived over here. The idea that they had some kind of sacred, unbroken claim to territory is a myth created by people who don't understand history. So when Europeans arrived and began competing for territory, they were entering into a system that already existed. They were participating in the same competition for land and resources that every group on the continent had been participating in for a millennia. The difference is that Europeans were better at it. They had technological advantages. They had organizational advantages. They had immunity to diseases that devastated indigenous populations. And they used those advantages to conquer territory, exactly like every successful civilization in history has done. That's not theft. That's conquest. And conquest has been the standard mechanism for establishing territorial control since the beginning of human civilization. Now, I can already hear the leftist response that I'm going to get. But conquest is wrong. Just because it happened throughout history doesn't make it right. Fine, let's accept that premise. Let's say conquest is morally wrong, and any land taken through conquest is illegitimate. Then give back England to the Celts. Give back Mexico to the indigenous peoples the Aztecs conquered. Give back China to whatever group was there before the Han Dynasty. Give back Turkey to the Byzantines. Give back every piece of territory that ever changed hands through warfare. Oh, you're not going to do that. You're only going to apply this standard to America and Western nations. Then you're not actually opposed to conquest. Get your head out of your asses. You're just using it as a political weapon against the countries you don't like. The stolen land narrative isn't based on consistent moral principles. It's based on selective outrage designed to delegitimize Western civilization while ignoring the exact same behavior by every other civilization in history. And here's the part that really exposes the hypocrisy. If Tribe A took land from Tribe B through conquest, and then Europeans that took that land from Tribe A, why is only the European conquest considered illegitimate? The Comanche took the Great Plains from other tribes through violence. Then Americans took the Great Plains from the Comanche through violence. By that logic of stolen land narrative, the Comanche were thieves too. So why do they get treated as the rightful owners, while Americans are treated as illegitimate occupiers? Because the narrative isn't about historical consistency. It's about creating a hierarchy where Western conquest is uniquely evil, while indigenous conquest is either ignored or justified. That's not justice. That's not historical accuracy. That's political propaganda designed to make you feel guilty for existing in the country that your ancestors built. I refuse to accept that guilt. My ancestors didn't steal this land. They conquered it. Just like every other group of humans throughout history has conquered territory from other groups. The difference is that my ancestors were successful at building a civilization on that conquered territory that became the most prosperous, most free, most powerful nation in human history. And instead of apologizing for that success, I'm proud of it. Because the alternative to American conquest of North America wasn't some peaceful indigenous utopia. It was continued tribal warfare, slavery, human sacrifice, and the eventual conquest by some other European power that might not have built a nation dedicated to individual liberty and human rights. The stolen land narrative asks me to feel guilty for living in a country that was built through the same historical processes that built every other country on earth. It asks me to pretend that conquest is uniquely American or uniquely Western, when it's actually universally human. I ain't playing that game. Conquest happened. Americans won. We built something extraordinary on that conquered territory. And I'm not going to apologize for it. So now, let's talk about the parts of American history that weren't even acquired through conquest. Let's talk about the massive portions of this country that were legally purchased or transferred through treaties and agreement. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803. America bought 827,000 square miles of territory from France for $15 million. That's about $18 per square mile. That territory includes all or part of 15 current states. It doubled the size of the United States overnight. What was stolen? France owned that territory through their own conquest and exploration. They sold it to America in legal transaction. Nobody forced them to sell. They made a voluntary agreement to transfer ownership in exchange for payment. The Gadsden Purchase of 1854. America bought 29,670 square miles from Mexico for $10 million. This territory, which includes parts of present-day Arizona and New Mexico, was purchased to facilitate a southern transcontinental railroad route. Again, legal purchase, voluntary agreement. Mexico could have refused to sell. They chose to accept the payment and transfer the territory. The Alaska Purchase of 1867. America bought 586,412 square miles from Russia for $7.2 million. At the time, critics called it Seward's Folly because they thought it was a waste of money. It turns out Alaska is incredibly valuable for resources, strategic position, and territory. Purchased, not conquered, not stolen, bought in a legal transaction with another nation that had claim to the territory. These purchases alone account for huge portions of American territory, and yet the stolen land narrative pretends they don't exist. They lump all American territory into one category, stolen, and ignore the historical reality that much of it was acquired through legal, consensual transactions. But what about the treaties with the indigenous tribes? This is where the left thinks they have their strongest argument. They claim that treaties were signed under duress, that they were broken by the American government, that they were based on fraud and coercion. Let's address this honestly. Yes, some treaties were signed under pressure. Yes, some treaties were broken. Yes, there were instances of fraud and coercion in dealing with indigenous peoples. But that doesn't change the fundamental fact that treaties are a legal mechanism for transferring land ownership. When a treaty is signed, even under less than ideal circumstances, it represents a formal agreement between sovereign entities about territorial control. Over 300 treaties were signed between the United States government and various indigenous nations. These treaties established boundaries, created reservations, provided compensation, and formalized the transfer of territorial control. Were all of these treaties perfect? No, of course they weren't. Were some of them violated by the American government? Of course they were. It's the government. But the existence of the treaties, even imperfect ones, demonstrates that there was a legal framework being applied to the transfer of land. This wasn't just random theft. This was a formalized process of negotiation and agreement. And here's what the left never wants to acknowledge. Many tribes signed treaties willingly because they recognized they were in weak positions militarily and economically. They chose to negotiate rather than fight. They chose to accept compensation and reservation land rather than risk complete destruction. That's not theft. That's negotiation between parties with unequal power. And while you might not like that, the power imbalance, it's how literally every peace treaty in human history has worked. The losing side accepts terms from the winning side to avoid worse outcomes. The Treaty of Versailles after World War I was signed by Germany under duress. Germany was defeated and had no choice but to accept harsh terms. Does that make the treaty illegitimate? Does that mean Germany was stolen from? No! Because that's how treaties work. When one of the sides loses the war, they negotiate from a position of weakness and accept terms that they wouldn't accept from a position of strength. The same principle applies to treaties between the United States and the indigenous tribes. Many tribes had been defeated militarily or recognized that they couldn't win a prolonged conflict. They negotiated treaties that gave up territorial claims in exchange for peace, compensation, and designated lands. Now, the left will point to broken treaties as evidence of American illegitimacy. And it's true that the federal government violated many treaty provisions over the years. But here's the question. Does a broken contract void the original agreement? Let me ask you this. If you buy a house and the seller fails to disclose some problems, does that mean you don't own the house? No. It means you might have legal recourse for breach of contract, but the fundamental transfer of ownership still occurred. The same principle applies to treaties. Even if the United States violated provisions of treaties, and it did, the land transfers that occurred as part of those treaties still happened. The legal framework existed. The sovereignty claims still transferred. You can argue that tribes are owed compensation for treaty violations. That's a legitimate legal and moral argument. But you can't argue that the land was stolen when there were formal legal agreements transferring ownership. And let's address the claim that indigenous peoples didn't understand what they were signing. The treaties were based on language barriers and cultural misunderstandings about property ownership. First, that argument is incredibly condescending to indigenous peoples. It treats them like children who couldn't understand the concept of territorial sovereignty or land ownership. The reality is that tribal leaders were sophisticated political actors who understood exactly what was at stake in the treaty negotiations. They may not have liked the terms. They might have been forced to accept terms they wouldn't have chosen freely. But they understood what the treaties meant. They understood they were ceding territorial claims in exchange for peace and compensation. Second, even if we accept that some treaties involved misunderstandings, that doesn't void the entire legal framework of the land transfer in North America. It might create claims for specific treaty violations, but it doesn't support the blanket statement that all American territory is stolen. The reality is that American territory was acquired through a combination of conquest, purchase, and treaty. All three of these mechanisms are recognized methods of territorial transfer under the international law and historical practice. Conquest has been the dominant method throughout human history. Purchase is a voluntary exchange. Treaties are formal legal agreements between sovereign entities. None of these constitute theft. Theft is taking something that doesn't belong to you without any legal or historical justification. It's what the Democrats do when you go out and you riot and you loot stores. What happened in North America was the standard process of territorial expansion and nation building that has happened throughout human civilization. The left wants to redefine conquest, purchase, and treaties as theft because it serves their political agenda of delegitimizing America. But words have meanings, and theft doesn't mean historical process I don't like. It means illegally taking something that belongs to someone else. Indigenous tribes didn't have legal ownership of North America in any sense that would be recognized under international law. They had territorial control based on their ability to hold and defend that territory. When they lost that ability to defend it, whether through military defeat or treaty negotiation, that territory transferred to new ownership. That's not theft. That's history. Let's talk about the complete logical collapse of the stolen land argument. Because once you start pulling at the threads, the whole narrative falls apart. If Americans are living on stolen land because we took it from indigenous people, then indigenous peoples are living on stolen land because they took it from other indigenous peoples. That's not my opinion, that's historical fact. The Iroquois Confederacy destroyed the Huron people and took their land. By the stolen land logic, the Iroquois are living on stolen land. The Comanche pushed the Apache out of the Great Plains and took their hunting grounds. By the stolen land logic, the Comanche are living on stolen Apache territory. I could go on and on. The Lakota Sioux took the Black Hills from the Cheyenne. By the stolen land logic, you know where I'm going. So, when activists do a land acknowledgement, recognizing indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants, which indigenous people are they talking about? The ones who were there first, the ones who conquered, the ones who were there first, the ones who conquered the conquerors? Your guess is as good as mine. Because if we're going back far enough to determine the real owners of the land, we'd have to trace every single conquest and displacement for thousands of years. And at the end of that process, we still wouldn't have a clear answer because the archaeological record doesn't go back far enough to identify the absolute first inhabitants of every piece of territory. This is the logical problem with the stolen land narrative. It applies a standard, opposition to conquest, that invalidates not just American claims to territory, but every historical claim by every group. If conquest creates illegitimate ownership, then there is no legitimate ownership anywhere. Every group is living on land that's taken from someone else. The entire concept of territorial sovereignty collapses. But the left doesn't want to apply this standard consistently. They only want to apply it to Western nations and specifically to the United States. That's not principle. That's selective enforcement designed to achieve a political outcome. Let me give you another logical inconsistency. The stolen land narrative claims that indigenous peoples have a special claim to North American territory because they were here first. But what does first mean in this context? The current indigenous populations of North America aren't the first humans to inhabit this continent. There were previous waves of migration and population. Archaeological evidence shows that different culture groups moving across North America over thousands of years, with earlier populations being displaced by later arrivals. So, if we're basing land claims on who was here first, we'd have to identify the absolute earliest human inhabitants and grant them the claim. But we can't do that because those earliest inhabitants were displaced and absorbed by later groups. The first argument is arbitrary. It picks a specific point in time, European contact, and declares that whoever held territory at that moment has the eternal legitimate claim. Why that moment? Why not thousands of years earlier? Why not 500 years earlier when different tribes controlled different territories? The only reason to pick European contact as the relevant moment is if you're trying to delegitimize European and American claims while legitimizing indigenous claims. But that's a political choice, not a logical principle. Here's another inconsistency. If land can never be legitimately acquired through conquest, then what's the statute of limitations on illegitimacy? The Norman conquest of England happened in 1066. That's almost 1,000 years ago. Does that conquest create ongoing illegitimacy? Should England be returned to the Anglo-Saxons? Should the Anglo-Saxons return it to the Celts? Or at some point, does conquest become legitimate simply through the passage of time and the establishment of a functioning government. If time legitimizes conquest, then American territorial claims are becoming more legitimate every year. We've held and governed this territory for over 200 years. We've built a nation, established laws, created infrastructure, and formed a distinct national identity. At what point does that history create legitimacy? Or is America uniquely excluded from the normal process by which nations establish themselves and gain international recognition? The left can't answer these questions because answering them honestly would require admitting that the stolen land narrative is not based on any consistent principles. It's based on the desire to delegitimize America specifically. Let me give you one more logical problem. The stolen land narrative implies that indigenous peoples have some kind of perpetual claim to North American territory that transcends conquest, treaties, and time. But on what basis? If it's based on being here first, that argument fails because they weren't here first. There were earlier populations. If it's based on a continuous occupation, that argument fails because tribal territory shifted constantly through conquest and displacement. If it's based on cultural connection to the land, that argument fails because it's purely subjective and could be claimed by anyone who's lived somewhere for any period of time. If it's based on international law, that argument fails because international law recognizes conquest, purchase, and treaties as legitimate means of territorial transfer. The only basis for the claim is moral. Conquest is wrong. Therefore, land acquired through conquest is illegitimate. But if you apply that principle consistently, it delegitimizes every nation on earth. So the stolen land narrative has to carve out a special category where American conquest is uniquely illegitimate, while every other conquest in history gets a pass. That's not logic. That's political bias masquerading as moral principle. Here's the bottom line. The stolen land argument cannot survive even basic logical scrutiny. It relies on inconsistent application of principles, arbitrary cutoff dates, and special pleading for indigenous peoples that wouldn't be granted to any other group. If you believe land can be legitimately owned, you have to accept that ownership can change through conquest, purchase, and treaties. That's how land has always changed hands throughout human history. If you believe land can never be legitimately acquired through conquest, you have to declare every nation on earth illegitimate, including indigenous tribal territories that were acquired through conquest of other tribes. You can't have it both ways. You can't claim that conquest delegitimizes American territorial claims while simultaneously claiming that indigenous peoples have legitimate claims to territory they acquired through conquest. The logical inconsistency is the proof that this isn't about justice or historical accuracy. It's about using history as a weapon against Western civilization. And I refuse to accept that weaponization as legitimate criticism. Let's stop pretending this is about historical justice or concern for indigenous peoples. Let's talk about what the stolen land narrative is actually designed to accomplish. This is about delegitimizing America and Western civilization. That's the goal. Everything else is window dressing. If you can convince Americans that their country exists on illegitimate territory, that the very ground they stand on was stolen, you create a permanent sense of moral debt. You make citizens feel like thieves just for existing in their own country. And once you've created that guilt, you can use it to justify all kinds of political objectives. You can justify massive wealth redistributions as reparations for stolen land. You can justify giving special legal status and benefits to indigenous groups. You can justify restrictions on private property rights because the property was never legitimate in the first place. You can justify weakening national sovereignty because the nation itself is built on theft. This is a psychological operation designed to make Americans question the very legitimacy of their country. And it's working on a lot of people, especially the young people who've been taught this narrative in schools and universities. Land acknowledgments are the perfect example of this. Before meetings, before classes, before public events, progressive organizations recite a statement acknowledging that they're on stolen indigenous land. What does this accomplish? What the hell is wrong with you people? It doesn't give land back to anyone. It doesn't compensate indigenous people for anything. It's purely performative. But what it does accomplish is the psychological conditioning. It normalizes the idea that America is illegitimate. It creates a ritual of apology and guilt that participants have to perform to signal their moral enlightenment. It's secular penance. You confess your sin of existing on stolen land, and by confessing, you prove you're one of the good ones who recognizes the evil of Western civilization. This is how you break down national identity. You make people ashamed of their country's history. You make them feel guilty for their ancestors' successes. You convince them that patriotism is actually complicitly in historical crimes. And once you've broken down that national identity, you can rebuild it as something else. Something that prioritizes global citizenship over American citizenship. Something that values social justice over individual liberty. Something that accepts ever-expanding government control as penance for historical sins. The stolen land narrative is a tool of cultural revolution. It's designed to destroy confidence in American institutions and American values so they can be replaced with progressive alternatives. And the proof is in how selectively the narrative is applied. Why is American conquest uniquely illegitimate while every other conquest in history gets a pass? Why don't we hear about stolen land in Mexico, which was built on Aztec conquest? Why don't we hear about the stolen land in China, which was built on thousands of years of imperial conquest? Why don't we hear about the stolen land in the Middle East, where borders have shifted through conquest for millennia? Because those countries aren't the target. America is the target. Western civilization is the target. And the stolen land narrative is ammunition in the fight to destroy them. This is also about creating permanent victim classes and permanent oppressor classes. If indigenous peoples are eternal victims of theft, they can never be expected to integrate fully into American society. They remain a separate class with special claims and special grievances. And if white Americans are eternal oppressors who stole the land, they can never be fully innocent regardless of their individual actions. They carry collective guilt that can never be fully absolved. This framework is perfect for left-wing politics because it creates permanent constituencies who need government intervention to address historical wrongs. It justifies ever-expanding programs, preferences, and restrictions in the name of correcting theft that happened generations ago. It's the same playbook they used for slavery reparations, for affirmative action, for every policy that treats people as members of groups rather than as individuals with equal rights. The stolen land narrative feeds into this system by creating one more historical grievance that requires government action to address. One more reason why traditional American values of individual liberty and equal treatment under the law need to be suspended in favor of collective justice and group-based redistribution. And here's the really insidious part. The people pushing this narrative know it's intellectually bankrupt. They know the logical inconsistencies. They know that they're applying standards selectively. They know that every civilization in history was built on conquest. They don't care because it's not about intellectual consistency. It's about power. It's about using historical guilt to advance political objectives. It's about breaking down American identity and American confidence so they can reshape the country according to their vision. That's why you see politicians and corporate executives who live in mansions on expensive land doing land acknowledgments. They're not giving their property back. They're not moving to another country. They're just performing the ritual that signals their membership in the progressive elite. It costs them nothing. It requires nothing. It's pure performance designed to demonstrate their moral superiority over the rubes who still think America is legitimate and worth defending. This is what I mean when I say the stolen land narrative is propaganda. It's not honest historical analysis. It's a political weapon designed to achieve specific objectives: weakening American national identity, creating permanent victim and oppressor classes, and justifying ever-expanding government power. And the truly sick part is that it doesn't actually help indigenous peoples. It doesn't improve their material conditions. It doesn't solve the real problems facing reservations: poverty, addiction, lack of economic opportunity. What it does is trap them in a permanent state of grievance, defining them entirely by their ancestors' defeat rather than their potential for success in the modern world. It encourages a victim mentality that makes progress impossible. That's not compassion. That's not justice. That's using indigenous peoples as props in a political struggle against Western civilization. The stolen land narrative is a lie designed to make you hate your country, question your heritage, and accept guilt for things you didn't do. It's designed to break your spirit and make you compliant to radical political change. I refuse to accept it, and you should too. The land wasn't stolen. It was conquered, purchased, and transferred through treaties. That's how nations are built. That's how borders are drawn. That's how human civilization has worked since the beginning of time. Indigenous peoples conquered each other for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. They took land through violence. They displaced weaker tribes. They built empires through military force. When Europeans entered that competition and won, they did exactly what every successful civilization in history has done. They established control. They built institutions, and they created a nation. That nation, the United States of America. It became the most prosperous, most free, most powerful country in human history. It's built on the principles of individual liberty, limited government, and human rights that were revolutionary when they were established and remain aspirational for most of the world today. I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not going to feel guilty for living in a country my ancestors built through the same historical processes that built every other nation on earth. The stolen land narrative is a lie designed to delegitimize America and Western civilization. It's based on logical inconsistencies, selective application of principles, and bad faith arguments that collapse under even basic scrutiny. It's propaganda, pure and simple. And it's time we started calling it that instead of treating it as legitimate historical criticism. America is legitimate. Our territorial claims are as valid as any nation's territorial claims. Our history is no more shameful than any other nation's history, and our civilization has produced more freedom and prosperity than any alternative in human existence. Stand up for that. Be proud of it. Stop accepting guilt for things that you didn't do and crimes that didn't happen. The land wasn't stolen, and I'm done pretending that it was. Before we wrap up, make sure you check out everything that we're doing at Truth in the Darkness. Visit TITDUSA.com for podcasts that don't back down from the truth. that don't apologize for Western civilization, that don't accept leftist propaganda as legitimate criticism. We've got political commentary, daily devotionals, investigative true crime, and Bible teaching. Support independent media that refuses to surrender to the narrative. Stand firm, speak truth, reject the lies, and I'll see you next time.